Chapter 1. Emma Woodhouse was beautiful, clever, and rich. She lived 16 miles from London, in the village of Highbury, and at nearly 21 years old, she thought her life was perfect. But nothing stays the same forever, and even the most perfect life must sometimes change. Emma was the younger of 2 daughters, but only she lived with her father at the family home. Her sister Isabella lived in London with her husband and 5 children. Emma's mother died when she was only 5, and so her father found Miss Taylor to live with them at Hartfield and look after his 2 daughters. Miss Taylor became their teacher and friend, and even after Emma had grown up and didn't need Miss Taylor as a teacher any longer, she continued to live with them and was part of the family. But Emma's comfortable life changed when Miss Taylor decided to get married to Mr. Weston. Although his house, called Randalls, was very near Emma's, she soon realized there would be a great difference between a Miss Taylor at Hartfield and a Mrs. Weston half a mile from Hartfield. And so Emma and her father were left alone together, both wishing that Miss Taylor was still there too. "What a pity Mr. Weston ever thought of Miss Taylor," said Mr. Woodhouse sadly. "I cannot agree, Papa. They are very happy together, and I am happy for them. And we shall see them often. They will come here to Hartfield, and we shall visit them at Mr. Weston's house. We shall always be meeting." But although Emma tried to make her father feel happier, she was just as sad as him. As they sat together playing cards on the evening after Miss Taylor's wedding, their friend Mr. Knightley came to visit them. His brother John was Isabella's husband, and he had just returned from their home in London. "How was the wedding? Who cried the most?" "Everybody was on time and looked their best," said Emma, "and there were no tears." "But I know how sad you must feel, Emma," said Mr. Knightley. "Yes, but I am happy that I made the match myself 4 years ago. People said Mr. Weston would never marry again, but I saw the possibility of love," said Emma. "And now Miss Taylor has left us," said Mr. Woodhouse. "So please do not make any more matches that might break up our circle of friends and family, Emma." Mr. Knightley did not agree with Emma. "I cannot see why you think you succeeded. It was no more than a lucky guess," he said. But Emma would not listen. She was sure it was because of her help that Miss Taylor had married Mr. Weston. And now she had the idea of making another match. "Mr. Elton, the vicar, he is such a good and handsome man. Everybody says so. And today, in the church, I could see that he would like it very much if it was his wedding. I wish I could help him to find a wife." "Leave him to choose his own wife," laughed Mr. Knightley. "He is 27 and can take care of himself." Mr. Woodhouse often invited his neighbours to Hartfield for an evening spent playing cards. Emma was happy to entertain their friends, although many of them were closer in age to her father than to her. But on one of these evenings, Emma was luckier, because one of their neighbours brought a young friend with her. 17-year-old Harriet Smith had been a pupil at the school in Highbury, and was still living there with the head teacher, because she had no living family. Harriet was very pretty, and she and Emma immediately became friends. Harriet was very impressed. She thought Emma was wonderful, and the surroundings of Hartfield were much better than she was used to. Emma liked Harriet a lot, and wanted to introduce her into good society. But first, she would have to help by teaching Harriet a few things. She decided this was a very kind and thoughtful plan. After that evening, Harriet spent a lot of time at Hartfield, and she and Emma were often together. Harriet told Emma about her school friend, Elizabeth Martin, and her family, who she had stayed with in the summer. Emma heard about the Martins' farm, and as she listened, she began to realize that Mr. Robert Martin was not the father of the family, but the son, and he was single. "Tell me about Mr. Robert Martin," Emma said. And Harriet did tell her. He was kind and clever, she said, and she liked him a lot. Emma thought a farmer was a most unsuitable friend for Harriet, and knew Mr. Elton, the vicar, would be a much better husband. She turned their conversation away from Robert Martin. "If you compare him to other young men, you will certainly see a difference. For example, Mr. Elton is a perfect gentleman. Did I tell you what he said about you the other day?" she asked, and told Harriet how beautiful he thought she was. Harriet was very pleased, and suddenly seemed to want to talk less about Mr. Martin. "I think Mr. Elton likes you a lot. Remember how he wanted me to paint a picture of you, and how he sighed over it when I had finished?" The painting had been Emma's idea at first, but when he heard about it, Mr. Elton was immediately enthusiastic and thought it a very good suggestion. Emma painted Harriet in the garden, and Mr. Elton wanted to watch. But he walked about so much and asked so many questions that it became difficult for Emma to think about painting and for Harriet to think about standing still. Finally, Emma asked him to sit down and read something to them. When the picture was finished, Mr. Elton thought it looked exactly like Harriet, but not everyone agreed. "The picture is a little too beautiful around the eyes," said Mrs. Weston. "Not at all," replied Mr. Elton. "Miss Smith is just as beautiful as Miss Woodhouse has painted her." Mr. Knightley knew Emma very well, and was always honest with her. He said, "You've made her too tall, Emma." "Oh, no," said Mr. Elton. "Not too tall. Exactly right in my opinion." That was when Emma first began to see the possibility of a match between them, and had great hopes that it would happen. Then Harriet had started talking about Robert Martin, and Emma worried that he might spoil her matchmaking plans. The next day she met Harriet in Highbury Village, and heard some unwelcome news. "Miss Woodhouse," said a very excited Harriet, "Mr. Martin has written to ask me to marry him." She showed Emma the letter, and she agreed it was certainly a very good letter. "So good that I wonder whether his sister helped him to write it," she said. "How shall I reply?" Harriet asked. "I cannot tell you. It must be your own letter," Emma replied. "But I am sure you will write it so that he will not be too unhappy." "So, you think I should refuse him?" said Harriet sadly, looking down. "I shall not advise you. This is something you must decide yourself." Harriet was silent. She looked at the letter again. "I had no idea he liked me so much," she said. Emma decided she must speak to save Harriet from an unsuitable marriage. Harriet, if you doubt your answer, of course you should refuse him. If you cannot say yes immediately, you must say no. Then I will refuse. Do you think I am right? Perfectly, dearest Harriet. And remember, Mr. Martin is only a farmer. He is not your equal or mine. If you married him, I could never visit you, said Emma. Harriet's letter was written and sent. She was a little quiet all evening, and once she said she hoped Mr. Martin and his sisters were not too sad. Emma tried to help her, and started talking about Mr. Elton again. We shall see him tomorrow, Harriet. He will come into this room and look at your picture again, and sigh as he always does when he sees it. Harriet smiled and became happier. When Mr. Knightley and Emma were in the gardens at Hartfield the next day, he spoke to her about Harriet. I congratulate you, Emma. She was always a pretty girl, but you have taught her a lot. I think your friend may get some news today that will make her happy. Emma thought at first that Mr. Elton might have said something to Mr. Knightley, but then he continued. Robert Martin asked my opinion of her. Was she too young to marry? Was it too soon to ask her? I advised him to ask. He's very much in love with her. He has already asked, said Emma, and she has refused him. What? She is a very foolish girl. Are you sure? Of course. I saw her answer. Mr. Knightley became angry with her. Saw it? You mean you wrote it? I think this was your idea, Emma. It was not. But I believe that, although he is a very pleasant young man, he is not Harriet's equal. Harriet Smith has no family and no money. This was a good match for her. Until she met you, she thought of nothing better for herself. But you have filled her head with ideas of high society and of how beautiful she is. She was happy enough with the Martins in the summer. Emma was unhappy because he was so angry with her, but she would not agree that she had been wrong. Now she knows what gentlemen are, she sees him differently. Now she is looking for something better. Remember, Emma, sensible men do not want silly wives. Harriet may not have another chance to marry, he replied. He started to walk away from her. And if you were thinking of Mr. Elton for Harriet, it will not work. He is a good vicar and a good man, but he will look for money and good family in a wife. Emma laughed. I am not trying to make a match for Harriet with Mr. Elton, she said, hoping that Mr. Knightley would stop being angry and stay. Believe me, Emma, Mr. Elton will choose sensibly, he said over his shoulder. Good morning to you. Chapter 2. Mr. Knightley was so angry that it was some time before he went to Hartfield again. When Emma saw him again, she could see that he had not forgiven her, and she was sorry about that. But she thought her plan was succeeding. Every time Mr. Elton met Harriet and Emma, he sighed a little more, and Emma was certain he really did love Harriet. Harriet was making herself a little book of poems, and some of the people she knew had suggested their favourites for the book. One day, Emma told Mr. Elton about it, and then she said, Perhaps you could write something for Harriet's book. You are so clever, it will be easy for you. I'm sure I couldn't do it, he replied. But the next day he called at Hartfield and left a paper with a short poem written on it. It was addressed to Miss... He means it for you, of course, said Emma. They read the poem together and saw that it was a very pretty love poem. Harriet was delighted with it. "Mr. Elton, he really is in love with me," she sighed. The poem was read to Mr. Woodhouse, and he said it was probably the best they had found. Then he started talking about Isabella. "She is coming next week, and they will all be here for Christmas." "We must ask Mr. and Mrs. Weston to dinner while they are here, Pa, and Harriet must come as often as she can," said Emma. "You will love my nieces and nephews," Emma said to Harriet, "and it will be a Christmas to remember." The next day, Emma had to visit a poor sick family in the village, and Harriet went with her. The road to their little house passed the church, and then later Mr. Elton's house, and for a moment they stopped to look at it. It was the first time Harriet had seen where Mr. Elton lived. "What a sweet house," said Harriet. "And there you and your book of poems will go one day. Then I shall often walk this way," replied Emma. They continued their walk and visited the family. Emma was a very kind young lady, and she took them food and clothes for the children, and tried to help as much as she could. As they started their walk back to Hartfield, they met Mr. Elton just as he was coming out of his house, and he asked if he could walk with them. Emma wanted to let Harriet and Mr. Elton walk together without her, and so she stopped and bent down to check her boot. They walked on, and seemed to be having an interesting conversation. Emma tried to keep a long way behind, but soon they stopped, turned, and waited for her to catch up with them. She had hoped Mr. Elton might take the opportunity to tell Harriet he loved her, but he didn't. "He is very careful," she thought. "He will not tell her until he is sure she loves him." But although she did not succeed with that plan, she was certain they had moved a little closer to the great day of their marriage. Isabella, John Knightley, and their children arrived at Hartfield the week before Christmas. Mr. Woodhouse was delighted to see them all again, and the family were happy to be together. They talked about their friends in Highbury, and, of course, they talked about Mr. and Mrs. Weston. "Do you see Mrs. Weston often?" asked Isabella. "Not as often as I would like, and she always goes away again," said Mr. Woodhouse sadly. "But remember poor Mr. Weston. She must go now that she is married, Papa," laughed Emma. "And what about the young man, Mr. Weston's son? Has he been to see his father since the wedding?" asked John Knightley. Everyone in Highbury knew about Mr. Weston's son, Frank, but nobody had seen him. Several times he had said he was coming, but each time something had happened to stop the visit. Frank's aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Churchill, had adopted him when his mother died. He was only a baby, and it seemed to Mr. Weston at the time that it was the best thing to do. The Churchills had no children of their own, and Frank took their family name. But Mrs. Churchill was very jealous and wanted to keep Frank for herself. Although Frank saw his father once a year in London, he had not yet met his new wife. If Frank Churchill finally did come to Highbury, it would be very exciting for Mr. and Mrs. Weston and for the whole village. Everybody looked forward to meeting him, especially Emma. Mr. Woodhouse told Isabella, "I have seen a letter he wrote to Mrs. Weston, and he seems a very pleasant young man. I am only sorry he is not here now, so that you could meet him, my dear." Mrs. Weston invited all the family to Randalls for dinner on Christmas Eve, and Harriet, Mr. Knightley, and Mr. Elton were asked to join them. 2 carriages were going from Hartfield, and Mr. Woodhouse arranged to meet Mr. Elton at his house and take him to Randalls with them. The day before, Harriet became ill with a cough and a bad throat, and so she could not go. Emma explained to Mr. Elton, and he said he was very sorry that Harriet was ill. Emma thought he might be so unhappy that he would not go to Randalls without Harriet, but he surprised her. "It is a pity our friend cannot join our little party, but I am looking forward to the evening," he told her. "We must hope she will soon feel better." Emma thought it strange that he was not more worried, but she said nothing. During the journey, he was quite happy, and even joked a little. He seemed to have forgotten poor Harriet, and was obviously enjoying himself. When they arrived at Randalls, Emma was surprised to find Mr. Elton at her side most of the time. She heard Mr. Weston telling the others something about Frank, but because Mr. Elton was talking to her, she could not hear everything. Emma had an interest in Frank Churchill, although she had never met him. They were about the same age, and because their 2 families were now joined in marriage, it seemed to her that he was the man she should marry. She thought Mr. and Mrs. Weston had probably had the same idea, perhaps her father also. At dinner, she was sitting next to Mr. Weston, and far from Mr. Elton, so she had a chance to ask about Frank. "I should like to see 2 more people here tonight. Your friend, Miss Smith, and my son," he said. "Did you know we had another letter from him this morning? He will be with us in a fortnight. Mrs. Weston doubts it, but I am sure he will come this time." "If you think he will come, I shall think so too," said Emma. She hoped he was right, because she wanted to meet Frank very much. The evening at Randalls was a very pleasant one, and as they left for home, it started to snow. Mr. Woodhouse, Isabella, and John all rode in the first carriage, and so Emma and Mr. Elton were alone in the second. They had just driven through the gates and reached the road, when suddenly Mr. Elton jumped up from his seat to sit next to Emma, and took her hand in his. She immediately moved across the carriage. "Mr. Elton, what are you thinking of? Please stop this minute," cried Emma, afraid that he had drunk too much of Mr. Weston's excellent wine. But Mr. Elton would not stop. He said he loved her, and he would die if she refused to marry him. Again he moved next to Emma, and again she moved away. "I cannot understand this," said Emma. "Surely it is Miss Smith you love, not me." "Miss Smith? How can you think that?" he asked. "But the painting and the poem. Explain yourself, Mr. Elton." "Miss Smith means nothing to me. I thought the artist was wonderful, not the subject. And the poem was for you." Mr. Elton tried to take Emma's hand again. "Miss Smith is a pretty, pleasant girl, and I wish her well, but my visits to Hartfield have been for you only." Emma was so surprised that she did not know what to say. Mr. Elton tried to take her hand again. "Your silence makes me think that you always understood me," he said. "Then I see we have both made a mistake. I do not wish you to have any interest in me, Mr. Elton, and I do not intend to marry anyone at present." After that, they sat silently until the carriage stopped outside Mr. Elton's house, and he got out. They both said a cold good night, and the carriage drove Emma home to Hartfield, where the family were waiting for her. Chapter 3. That night it was difficult for Emma to sleep. For herself, she did not worry about what had happened in the carriage with Mr. Elton, but she felt very sad for Harriet. "Harriet has grown to like this man, and then to love him," she thought. "And it was because of me." She remembered what Mr. Knightley had said to her about him that day in the garden. "Mr. Elton will choose sensibly," he had said. And now it seemed he was right. He had not wanted Harriet, had never thought about her as a wife. All the time it had been Emma he wanted. But she knew the first and worst mistake had been hers. It was wrong and foolish to try to bring two people together, and she was ashamed of herself. "It was enough that I talked her out of love with Mr. Martin. There, at least I was right," she thought. The next day, Emma was pleased to see a lot of snow outside. This was a good thing, because it meant she could not go to church and see Mr. Elton, or go to visit Harriet, and none of them could meet. The snow stayed for several days after Christmas, and the only visitor to Hartfield was Mr. Knightley. As soon as the snow disappeared, Isabella, John, and the children went back to London. The same evening, a letter arrived for Mr. Woodhouse from Mr. Elton. It said he was leaving Highbury the next day and going to Bath to spend a few weeks with friends. There was no message in the letter for Emma, and she was a little angry about that, but also pleased he was going away. She knew the next thing she must do was to speak to Harriet and tell her everything. Harriet cried, but she did not blame Emma at all for what had happened. They went back to Hartfield together, and Emma tried very hard to make Harriet feel better. But she knew only time could help her to forget. Perhaps when Mr. Elton returned, they might all be able to meet without feeling embarrassed. Mr. Frank Churchill did not come. He wrote a letter of excuse, and in it he said, "I hope to come to Randalls quite soon." Both Mr. and Mrs. Weston were very sorry, but they decided perhaps the spring was a better time to visit, and maybe he could stay for a longer time then. Emma gave Mr. Knightley the news, and blamed the Churchills, especially his aunt. Mr. Knightley did not agree. If he wanted to see his father, he could come. He is 23 or 4. At that age it is not impossible. A short time ago he was in Weymouth, so he can leave the Churchills when he wants to, he said. It may not be easy for him all the time. His aunt and uncle may need him at home. Why do you dislike him so much? Asked Emma. I neither like nor dislike him, because we have never met. But I cannot understand why this is so difficult for him. He seems a very weak young man. We shall never agree about that, said Emma. Perhaps he is just a kind and gentle man. Perhaps he does not want to make his aunt unhappy. He is certainly very good at writing letters and making excuses, but Mrs. Weston must feel very insulted because he has not come to meet her. Emma knew Mr. Knightley was becoming angry about Frank Churchill, and she could not understand why. "I believe he will come soon," she said. "And when he does, everyone in Highbury will be very excited. We are all interested and want to meet him." "Oh, I never think of him from one month to another," was all Mr. Knightley said. Emma and Harriet were out walking one morning, and, in Emma's opinion, had talked enough about Mr. Elton for one day. Harriet could not forget him, and still loved to hear his name. They were near the house where some old friends lived, and Emma decided a visit to them may help Harriet to think about other things. Mrs. and Miss Bates loved to have visitors, and Emma did not call at their house as often as she knew she should. They were quite poor, but there was always tea and cake and a warm welcome for their visitors. Miss Bates loved to talk, and because her old mother was deaf, she repeated conversations by shouting at her. They were delighted to see Emma and Harriet, and made them sit near the fire and have tea with them. They asked Emma about their old friend Mr. Woodhouse, and were happy when she said he was in very good health. "Have you heard from Miss Fairfax recently?" asked Emma, hoping they had not just received a letter. Jane Fairfax was Miss Bates's niece. Her parents had died when she was young, and she had come to Highbury to live with her grandmother and aunt. But then an old friend of her father's, a Mr. Campbell, had offered to look after her, and Jane had gone to live with his family. Mr. and Mrs. Campbell had a daughter the same age as Jane, and they were a rich family, so Jane was very lucky. Mrs. and Miss Bates were very sad when she left Highbury, but they knew it was much better for her to live in London with the Campbell family. She wrote to her aunt and grandmother regularly, and sometimes came to stay with them. Emma and Jane Fairfax were about the same age, and they knew each other, but they were never friends. Miss Bates liked to tell everyone in Highbury about Jane, because they were generally interested in her. Only Emma was not interested. She was bored with Jane's letters and hearing all about her life. But Miss Bates was a very kind lady, and she knew it was polite to ask. "We had a letter just this morning. Jane is coming to stay next week." "How lovely for you. And how long will she stay?" "For 3 months at least, and we are so excited, Miss Woodhouse," said Miss Bates. "I said we are very excited," she shouted at her mother. "The Campbells are going to Ireland, and because Jane has had a bad cold recently, she decided not to travel with them," she explained. "Now, let me read you the whole letter, Miss Woodhouse." But although she knew it was not polite to go so suddenly, Emma did not want to stay and hear the letter. "I am so sorry, but we must go now," she said. "My father will be waiting for us." Emma and Harriet left the house, although Miss Bates tried very hard to make them stay a few more minutes. They promised to return the next week when Jane was there, and Emma invited Mrs. and Miss Bates to come to Hartfield with Jane for an evening of music. The evening at Hartfield was pleasant, and everyone enjoyed the music. Mr. Knightley was invited, also Harriet and Mr. and Mrs. Weston, so there was quite a big party. Both Jane and Emma sang and played the piano, but Jane was much better. Emma tried to make conversation with her. She always found it difficult, because Jane was quiet and a little cold. She often seemed unfriendly, and Emma did not know why. As she tried to find something to say, she remembered Miss Bates telling her that Jane had spent some time the summer before in Weymouth. "Did you meet Mr. Frank Churchill? I understand he was also in Weymouth last summer." "Yes, we were introduced," said Jane. "Tell me about him. Was he handsome?" "People seem to think so." "And sensible, interesting, clever?" But Jane told her nothing. "It is difficult to say. We did not meet often. He is very polite," was all she said. Emma was not at all satisfied with that, and disliked Jane more than before. The next day, the same news came to Hartfield from 2 different people. First, Mr. Knightley, then Miss Bates. Mr. Elton was going to be married. Emma was surprised. It was only 4 weeks since he had left Highbury. "He is marrying a Miss Hawkins of Bath. That is all I know," said Miss Bates. "A new neighbour for us all, Miss Woodhouse. My mother is so pleased." "We are all pleased, of course," said Emma, without looking at Mr. Knightley. That afternoon, Emma decided she must tell Harriet the news when she called, before she heard it from Miss Bates or someone else. But it started to rain, and Harriet did not come at her usual time. When she arrived later, the first thing she said was, "Oh, Miss Woodhouse, what do you think has happened?" Emma thought at once that Harriet knew about Mr. Elton, but it was a different story that she told. "It started to rain as I was walking through Highbury, so I decided to wait in one of the shops until the rain stopped. And who do you think came into the shop?" Emma could not guess, but she could see how excited Harriet was. "Elizabeth Martin and her brother. I did not know what to do. I was sitting near the door, and Elizabeth saw me immediately. But he did not, because he was busy with the umbrella. Then they both went to the other side of the shop, and I kept sitting there. I could not go away because of the rain. At last he saw me, and they whispered together for a little. And then, Miss Woodhouse, what do you think?" Harriet stopped for breath, and Emma said, "I really do not know, Harriet. Do tell me." "They came across to me, and we shook hands and stood talking for some time. Then I saw that the rain had nearly stopped, so I said I must go. And now here you are. Miss Woodhouse, I did not want it to happen, but it was so nice to speak to them again. Did I do the right thing?" asked Harriet. Emma thought about it. As Harriet was so pleased to see Mr. Martin again, she might not be too upset at the news about Mr. Elton, so the meeting must be a good thing. "You behaved perfectly, Harriet. Now it is over, and, as a first meeting, it can never happen again." For some time, Harriet could not talk about anything except the Martins, and Emma was right. The news about Mr. Elton did not shock her so very much, after all. Chapter 4. Mr. Elton returned to Highbury a happy man. It was not long before everyone knew about his future wife. Her name was Augusta Hawkins, and she came from a family with money. £10,000 was the rumour in Highbury. Emma only saw him once or twice before he went to Bath again, but Harriet always seemed to see him, or hear his voice. Everyone said he looked very much in love, and when she heard that, Harriet became more unhappy. One day, when they were shopping in Highbury, Emma and Harriet met Mr. and Mrs. Weston. "We have just been sitting with your father," said Mr. Weston. "We wanted to tell you the good news. Frank is coming tomorrow and staying for a whole fortnight. We had a letter this morning." "And we shall soon bring him over to Hartfield," said Mrs. Weston. They were both very happy, and Emma was delighted. She hoped Mr. Elton might be talked about less when Frank Churchill arrived in Highbury, and was looking forward to meeting him at last. The next morning, Emma was in her bedroom when she heard voices downstairs, and when she walked into the drawing-room, there sat her father with Mr. Weston and his son. Mr. Weston introduced her, and explained that Frank had come a day earlier than they thought. He was a very handsome man, and he looked sensible and friendly. She felt immediately that she would like him. As they talked together, Frank asked Emma about herself and Highbury. Did she like walking and riding? Was it a pleasant society in Highbury? Did they have musical evenings? And dancing? Were there balls? They talked about Mrs. Weston, and Frank said how much he liked her already. Emma looked at Mr. Weston, and could see what he was thinking. He had wanted to see them as a couple. After some time, Mr. Weston said they must go, because he had business in Highbury, and Frank said he might spend the time visiting some people he knew a little. "Miss Jane Fairfax and I met last summer in Weymouth. Do you know the family she lives with?" Of course, Mr. Woodhouse was delighted to give Frank directions to find Mrs. Bates's house. "Miss Fairfax is a beautiful woman and a brilliant musician," said Emma, and Frank agreed, but with a very quiet yes. "Her aunt will talk to you without stopping," she continued, "but they will make you very welcome." And so they left. But the next morning, Mr. Frank Churchill went to Hartfield to see Emma again, this time with Mrs. Weston. All three walked together into Highbury, and had a very pleasant morning. The more Emma talked to Frank, the more she believed Mr. Knightley had been wrong about him. They stopped to look at the Crown Inn, a hotel in Highbury, and Mrs. Weston told Frank about the ballroom there. He was immediately interested, although Emma said it was not used for balls any more. Frank looked through the windows and said it was a beautiful room and should be used again. "You must arrange it, Miss Woodhouse," he said, and Emma laughed at the idea. Emma's good opinion of Frank was shaken a little the next day when she heard he had gone to London just to have his hair cut. There was nothing wrong with that, except that it did not seem very sensible. But generally everyone in Highbury seemed to think Frank was a very good young man. Everyone except Mr. Knightley. He was not surprised to hear about Frank's trip to London, and said he thought it was a silly thing to do. That evening, Frank returned to Randalls from London. He had had his hair cut, and laughed at himself for doing it. He was not ashamed, and Emma began to think there was nothing wrong in it after all. There was other news in Highbury that was more important. Some neighbours, Mr. and Mrs. Cole, were going to hold a dinner party. The Coles had a large and beautiful house. There was always music there, and there might possibly be dancing. On the night of the party, Emma's carriage arrived at the Coles' house behind Mr. Knightley's. "I am surprised to see your carriage," she said. "You usually walk or ride everywhere, but this is more suitable for a gentleman, so now I shall really be very happy to walk into the same room with you." Mr. Knightley laughed at her, and they went into the party together. At dinner, Emma sat next to Frank, and they talked together about society in Highbury. Jane Fairfax sat across the table from them, wondering what they were talking about. Emma wondered whether other guests thought she and Frank were a special couple. After dinner, when he joined the ladies in the drawing room, he came across the room and sat next to Emma again. She began to realize that his life with his aunt and uncle was very boring. "We never see anyone new, and never have parties. My aunt is often ill, and it is difficult for her to let me go away from home on my own." Harriet and some other young ladies were invited to arrive after dinner, and Emma was happy to see Harriet looking pretty and confident when she came into the room. Frank spoke to Jane for a short time, and was polite and friendly to Miss Bates. Before he could get back to his seat next to Emma, Mrs. Weston had taken it. "I have just made a little plan," said Mrs. Weston. "How do you think Miss Bates and her niece came here tonight?" she asked. "I suppose they walked." "Exactly. I suddenly thought it was not a very good idea for Jane to walk home late on a cold night, so Mr. Weston suggested to Miss Bates that we should take them in our carriage. But she said Mr. Knightley had already offered his. I wonder if that is why he used his carriage. You know he usually walks." "Yes, that is typical of him," said Emma. "You know how kind he always is. But perhaps it is more than kindness. The more I think about it, the more I am sure that I have made a match between Miss Fairfax and Mr. Knightley. Dear Mrs. Weston, how could you think of such a thing? Mr. Knightley must not marry. Isabella's son should have the family house after him. No, no, I cannot agree with Mr. Knightley's marrying, and I am sure it is not at all likely to happen," whispered Emma. "And Jane Fairfax, too, of all women," she added. "She has always been a favourite with him," said Mrs. Weston, "and I cannot see anything unsuitable in the match." Emma would not listen. "Mr. Knightley does not want to marry. Why should he? He is happy by himself with his farm and his sheep and his library." "But if he really loves Jane Fairfax—" "No, no, you are quite wrong. Believe me, this is not a good match, or a possible one," Emma replied. They talked a little more, and then, when Emma looked around, she saw that Frank was sitting with Jane. At that moment, Mr. Cole asked Emma to play the piano and sing. She agreed, but after 2 songs, she invited Jane to play. Emma sat down and looked across at Mr. Knightley. He was listening very carefully to Jane, and Emma started to wonder about what Mrs. Weston had said. When Jane finished her songs, somebody suggested dancing, and the room was quickly prepared. Mrs. Weston sat at the piano, and immediately Frank took Emma's hand and led her to the centre of the room. While the other couples were getting ready, Emma looked round for Mr. Knightley. She knew he did not like dancing, and if he danced with Jane Fairfax, it might possibly mean something. But she saw he was talking to Mrs. Cole, and another man had asked Jane to dance. Emma enjoyed dancing with Frank, and was sorry that there were only 2 dances before someone said it was getting late, and they all ought to go home. Frank took Emma to her carriage. "Perhaps it was a good thing we had to stop," he said. "Soon I would have had to ask Miss Fairfax, and she does not dance as well as you. Dancing with you was wonderful. he told her as they said good-night. Chapter 5. The evening at Mr. and Mrs. Cole's house had been a very happy one. Emma looked back on it and smiled, and so did Frank Churchill. He had enjoyed the dancing so much that all the next day he was thinking of how to arrange more. When Mr. Woodhouse and Emma called at Randall's the next evening, he told Emma his idea. The dancing we started at the Coles could be finished here at Randall's, he said, with the same people and the same musician. What do you think? They thought it was a good idea. Mr. and Mrs. Weston were happy to use their house, and Mrs. Weston said she would play the music as long as they wanted to dance. Together, they added up the number of couples, and then looked at the size of the 2 rooms at Randall's that could be used. 5 couples. Is the room big enough? Perhaps the other room. Should we also invite Miss Cox and Miss Gilbert and her cousins? Soon, the 5 couples had become 10, and Randall's was certainly not big enough for that. If it was so crowded, nobody could dance, they decided. Frank did not give up the idea, though, and by the middle of the next day, he was at Hartfield to suggest another plan to Emma and her father. What do you think of having our little ball at the Crown Inn? He asked. They discussed the idea and decided it was a possibility. The room was much bigger, and there was another room for dinner. My father and Mrs. Weston are at the Crown at this moment, looking at the rooms, said Frank. They would like you to join them and give your opinion. Mr. Woodhouse stayed at home, but Frank and Emma went immediately to the Crown. Emma and Mrs. Weston thought the room was a little dirty, although Mr. Weston and Frank did not agree. Someone suggested asking Miss Bates to come and look, and Frank went across to her house. Miss Bates and Jane came and looked at the rooms and listened to the plan. Yes, they agreed. The Crown was the best place for the dance, and they all spent the next half an hour walking from room to room and talking about the ball. The only other thing to arrange was that Frank must write to his aunt and uncle to tell them he was staying in Highbury for another few days. As people heard the news about the ball, they were very excited. Jane Fairfax told Emma she was looking forward to it, and Harriet talked about it a lot. Mr. Knightley was the only one of Emma's friends who did not seem interested. Unfortunately, a few days before the ball, a letter came from Mrs. Churchill. She was very ill, it said, and Frank must return home immediately. Emma was very upset when she heard the news. All their plans for the ball were ended, and Frank was going away. He came to Hartfield to see Emma and her father before he left for home. Of all the most horrible things, saying goodbye is the worst, he said to Emma. He looked very unhappy. You will come again, she replied. But I cannot say when. I shall certainly try, and then we shall have our ball. And now there is no time to say goodbye to Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax before you go, said Emma. I did call there on my way here, just for 3 minutes, he said. My father will be here very soon, and then I must leave immediately. Miss Woodhouse, it has been a wonderful fortnight. I shall think of you all and dear Highbury. Mrs. Weston has said she will write with all the news, but until I can be here again... He stopped and looked at Emma, and she thought, he must really be in love with me. He was just going to speak again when his father arrived with Mr. Woodhouse behind him. and there was only time to shake her hand and say goodbye before he left. It was a sad change for Emma. They had met almost every day that Frank had been in Highbury, and now Emma's life seemed very quiet. That night she wrote in her diary, "I suppose I am in love with him. I think about him a lot, and everything is so very boring without him." Mr. Knightley was not sorry to see Frank go, but he was sorry that Emma was upset. "You have so few opportunities for dancing, Emma. You are really very much out of luck," he said to her. In time, Emma told herself she was only a little in love with Frank. She was happy to hear about him from Mrs. Weston and see his letters, but she was not really unhappy without him. Soon she thought of him as only a dear friend. In his first letter he had spoken about Harriet. "Please say my goodbye to Miss Woodhouse's beautiful little friend." Now that Emma was not in love with Frank herself, a little idea started to grow in her mind. She told herself not to think about it, because after Mr. Elton, she knew matchmaking was a dangerous thing. But once the idea had come into her mind, she could not completely forget it. Almost as soon as Frank Churchill left Highbury, Mr. Elton and his new wife arrived, and suddenly everyone was talking about them. Harriet was unhappy about meeting them, and talked about it a lot. They first saw Mrs. Elton at church, but soon after Emma decided she and Harriet must call on her at her home. Emma did not really like Mrs. Elton. She seemed a little too comfortable in a new place with new people. She was not very elegant, Emma thought. She dressed well and was pretty, but she did not seem a lady. When Mr. Elton came into the room, he looked very uncomfortable. But Emma thought it was really bad luck for him. He had married Augusta, he had wanted to marry Emma, and Harriet had wanted him to marry her. And now they were all in the same room at the same time. The visit was short, and in time Mr. and Mrs. Elton returned it by visiting Hartfield. There, Mrs. Elton talked a lot about her brother and sister and their house. She said it was a lot like Hartfield. "This room is just like their drawing room. Do you agree, Mr. E? And the gardens. When my brother comes to visit us, we must all come to see your gardens, Miss Woodhouse." Emma liked her even less than before, and Mr. Elton had very little opportunity to speak at all. "Is there a musical society in Highbury, Miss Woodhouse? Do you play?" she asked. Emma said she did. "We must start a little music club. It will be so amusing, don't you think?" Before she could answer, Mrs. Elton continued. "We have just come from Randalls. What lovely people Mr. and Mrs. Weston are. He is quite a favourite of mine already. Mrs. Weston was your teacher, I think?" Emma did not have time to reply. "I knew that, and so I was a little surprised to find that she is such a lady. And who do you think arrived while we were there?" she asked. Emma could not think of anybody to suggest. "Knightley! Knightley himself! Was it not lucky? A very good friend of Mr. E.'s, and I like him already. Knightley is quite the gentleman." Happily, it was then time for Mr. and Mrs. Elton to leave. Emma could breathe again. "What an awful woman," she thought. "A very rude woman. Knightley, she called him. A music club. And she was surprised that Mrs. Weston was a lady. I do not like her at all." Mr. Woodhouse was kinder. "A very pretty young woman," he said. but she speaks a little too quickly. It hurts the ear." "Dear Papa," said Emma, "you are too kind." During the next few weeks, Emma did not see anything to change her opinion of Mrs. Elton. She was rude and thought herself very important, but Mr. Elton seemed happy and proud of her. Emma wondered whether it was just because of the £10,000. Mrs. Elton seemed to know Emma did not like her, so she stayed away from Hartfield, but she became very interested in Jane Fairfax, and decided Jane needed her help as an introduction into good society. Emma felt very sorry for Jane, who was more elegant than Mrs. Elton could ever be. One afternoon at Randalls, Emma, Mrs. Weston, and Mr. Knightley were discussing Jane. "Why does she stay here so long?" wondered Emma. "She could go home to the Campbells, and I cannot understand why she prefers to be here month after month." "If she stays, she will have to see Mrs. Elton a lot of the time, and I cannot believe she will like that," said Mrs. Weston. "But perhaps she likes to be away from her aunt and grandmother occasionally." Mr. Knightley agreed. "And if there is no other person to be with," he said, looking at Emma. "I know how much you like Jane Fairfax. Perhaps you like her more than you realize," Emma said to him. "Oh, I see what you are thinking of. I am sure Miss Fairfax would not have me if I asked her, and I am also sure I will never ask her," he replied. Mrs. Weston touched Emma's foot with hers. Mr. Knightley continued. "So, you have decided that I should marry Jane Fairfax, have you?" "Not at all," said Emma. "You were angry with me before for matchmaking, and I had no idea of trying it with you. You would not come and sit with us in this comfortable way if you were married." Emma thought Mr. Knightley might be angry with her if he thought she and Mrs. Weston were matchmaking him with Jane, but she was surprised to see that he seemed a little amused by the idea. "I like Jane Fairfax, of course, but I have never thought of being in love with her, not once," he said. After he had left, Emma said to Mrs. Weston, "Now, what do you think about Mr. Knightley marrying Jane Fairfax?" "My dear Emma, I think he tries too hard to tell us he is not in love with her. I would not be surprised if he was. I